Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Plato's Phaedrus. So this is a Socratic dialogue written by Plato. It's a unique one in many ways, one of which being that it's about rhetoric, and for the most part, it's relatively positive about rhetoric. Whereas in many of the Socratic dialogues, Socrates via Plato is pretty down on rhetoric, especially the sophists. Now, in the Phaedrus, Sophocles declares himself to be a lover of speeches, who's enamored by speeches, which is not the Sophocles we necessarily know from a lot of other Platonic dialogues. But that becomes the foundation for Plato's ultimate contention in this dialogue, which is that rhetoric must inherently be based in philosophy, based in a love of the truth and a love of wisdom. So it's a dialogue of two parts, really. And that has apparently confused a lot of people who take the first part to be the key component, whereas I really think the second part is the key component. So the first part consists basically of three speeches about love, specifically pederastic love. So in ancient Greece, in Athens in particular, pederastic love was very, very standard. So an older man would take a younger boy, man, young man, adolescent age, whatever it is, as a lover. And this served a major social function because this was a way, part of the expectation of this was that the older man would train the young man in things like good citizenship, in maybe rhetoric, public speaking, engaging in politics, how to be properly involved in the rituals that were part of Athenian civic life, etc., etc. So this was essentially a method of education that also just involved having sex with a young, beautiful man. So, hey, it was a different time. Clearly not the education model that we want today, but it worked for them. So in these three speeches, there is no question of whether or not these pederastic relationships are good. That's just assumed. The three speeches, what the speeches differ on is the question of whether or not it's better for a young man to be with an older man who loves him or who doesn't love him. So the first speech, which Phaedrus recites, is from Lysias, who was regarded as a great speech writer and rhetorician. And he argues in this speech that there are a lot of advantages for the boy to be with a man who does not love him. And basically the sort of key things with this are like, lovers are selfish. They're going to want to just keep you to themselves. They're going to want you to be all soft and whatever. And so they're not going to be like, go train in the gym and get all manly so you can fight in the wars and whatnot. And they'll, like, once their passion is expended, they will lose interest in actually helping you, etc., etc. So these are the kinds of arguments that Lysias makes. Socrates, I'm a drama person, so I may say Sophocles by mistake, but Socrates is basically like, yeah, that's an okay speech, but I think that the muses may inspire me to give a better one. So Socrates gives his own speech arguing why it's better for a boy to be with someone who doesn't love him, largely revolving around the idea that love is a kind of madness, and so you lose control of your rational faculties, etc., etc., and that's inherently bad. But then Socrates is like, I just realized that both of these speeches are wrong, particularly because love is a god, Eros is a god, and it's blasphemous to be like Eros is bad. So Socrates is then like, I'm going to make one more speech where I'm going to make the argument that even though love is a form of madness, it's actually good, and that it's better for a boy to choose as an adult male lover someone who does love him. And basically, Socrates develops this theory of, like, it's connected to the idea of ideal forms that runs throughout Plato's at least middle works. But basically, he has this idea that initially all of the souls were up in heaven and they got sort of dumped down. The ones who they were all like jostling to be near the gods and whatever, and they got sort of dumped down and they came to inhabit human bodies. And basically, it's a sort of reincarnation karma type thing where after 10,000 years, you can either ascend to a slightly higher plane of existence, become a better type of person, or get sort of kicked down to either a worse type of person or even into an animal. But philosophers, because they love wisdom and beauty are like the highest ideals and the most perfect of the ideal forms or whatever it is, if they pursue knowledge and beauty, they can ascend back into the heavens after only 3,000 years. So Plato has this whole setup, or Socrates has this whole setup in Plato's dialogue that he wrote. And so essentially the upshot of this is that Socrates is arguing that it's better to be with someone who loves you because they will try and draw you toward beauty and philosophy and these ideal forms, and that's going to help raise your soul back up to the heavens. So that's what we've got. The second half of the dialogue is about rhetoric. It's about how to make good speeches and why. So one of the things that Socrates and Phaedrus establish pretty early in this section. Socrates. I feel like I might have slipped and said Sophocles again, but Socrates. Socrates says, it's not speaking or writing well that's shameful. What's really shameful is to engage in either of them shamefully or badly. Phaedrus says that is clear. Mostly Phaedrus's responsibility in the second half is to just say, yeah, Socrates, you're totally right. So, and then Sophocles sets the task for the last portion of the dialogue. So what distinguishes good from bad writing? Now, one of the key elements to this question for Socrates is truth value. Socrates says, won't someone who's to speak well and nobly have to have in mind the truth about the subject he's going to discuss? And Phaedrus says, what I've actually heard about this, Socrates, my friend, is that it is not necessary for the intending orator to learn what is really just, but only what will seem just to the crowd who will act as judges. Nor again what is really good or noble, but only what will seem so. For that is what persuasion proceeds from, not truth. Now, this is an interesting point about rhetoric, because both Plato / Socrates and Aristotle in his rhetoric kind of assume that writing that is true or writing that expresses truth will inherently be more persuasive. Aristotle kind of argues in the rhetoric that ethos is the most important of the three rhetorical appeals because the character of a speaker determines the persuasiveness of the speech. Not in terms, like today we often think about ethos as things like qualifications, background, experience, knowledge of the subject, etc., etc. For Aristotle, it's who is this person as an ethical being? And he asserts basically that an ethically good person will be a more persuasive speaker. Now, Socrates takes issue with this idea that the goal of rhetoric is just to persuade or to seem persuasive. And basically, he goes through a whole philosophical argument that expressing the truth and sort of having genuine knowledge through a sort of dialectical process of inquiry is the most persuasive approach. Interestingly, though, he does emphasize audience awareness, which is one of the things I think is really, really important. Like when I teach rhetoric, audience awareness is always, almost always at the forefront of the way that I teach it. And Socrates emphasizes this as well. So I want to bring that up. So the speaker, according to Socrates, will classify the kinds of speech and of soul there are, as well as the various ways in which they are affected, and explain what causes each. He will then coordinate each kind of soul with the kind of speech appropriate to it, and he will give instructions concerning the reasons why one kind of soul is necessarily convinced by one kind of speech, while another necessarily remains unconvinced. Then a little bit later, he says, since the nature of speech is in fact to direct the soul, whoever intends to be a rhetorician must know how many kinds of soul there are. Their number is so and so many, each is of such and such a sort. Hence some people have such and such a character, and others have such and such. Those distinctions established, there are, in turn, so and so many kinds of speech, and each of such and such a sort. People of such and such a character are easy to persuade by speeches of such and such a sort in connection with such and such an issue for this particular reason, while people of such and such another sort are difficult to persuade for those particular reasons. That's a bit convoluted, but you get what I'm saying, I think. Basically, there are different kinds of people, different kinds of audience members, and they will be persuaded by different things depending on what kind of soul they have, or depending on who they are as an audience member, as I would put it. Then he goes on, he says, the orator must learn all this well, then put his theory into practice and develop the ability to discern each kind clearly as it occurs in the actions of real life. Otherwise, he won't be any better than he was when he was still listening to those discussions in school. He will now not only be able to say what kind of person is convinced by what kind of speech. On meeting someone, he will be able to discern what he is like and make clear to himself that the person actually standing in front of him is of just this particular sort of character he had learned about in school. To that, he must now apply speeches of such and such a kind in this particular way in order to secure conviction about such and such an issue. When he has learned all this, when, in addition, he has grasped the right occasions for speaking and for holding back, and when he's also understood when the time is right for speaking concisely or appealing to pity or exaggeration, or for any other of the kinds of speech he has learned, and when it is not, then, and only then, will he have finally mastered the art well and completely. So, Plato asserts, via Socrates, that the primary purpose of rhetoric is to do good. You are moving souls, as Socrates puts it in the Phaedrus. And you have an ethical obligation to move souls in a positive direction, to move souls in a good way. In order to do that, according to Socrates, you have to know what kind of soul you're addressing. So again, this is very central to the way that we still think about rhetoric today. Audience awareness and what kinds of arguments, what kinds of evidence, what kinds of appeals, what kinds of information are going to persuade a particular kind of audience. So it's foundational rhetoric stuff here that Plato is developing in the Phaedrus. The other thing that's worth a mention, that's very interesting here, is an argument that Socrates makes against writing. And basically, he argues that writing leads to forgetfulness, because before education was writing based, education involved memorization. So you memorized the arguments of whoever it is. Why am I blanking on the name of every Greek philosopher other than Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle? You memorized the arguments of Pythagoras or Diogenes or whoever it was. Like whoever you were learning from, you just memorized their stuff. And that was the way that you learned philosophy, or you learned rhetoric, or whatever it is, was through memorization. What Plato argues in this bit is basically that by being able to write stuff down, people aren't going to have to remember it. And so that's going to weaken their minds and their critical faculties. Now, the reason that's particularly interesting is because as new technologies develop later on, particularly things like radio, television, movies, and the internet, these same arguments have been used by critics of new media to defend the written word. It's better to read than to watch movies. It's better to read than watch TV, etc., etc. And the irony is that they are deploying the same kinds of arguments that Plato makes in the Phaedrus against writing itself. But they're now using those arguments to defend writing.